Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, where we'll be discussing what's next for the UK's Department for International Development, looking at funding as well as the political landscape. I'm Sophie Edwards, a senior reporter here at Devex, and I'll be your moderator for today. If at any point you have difficulty viewing or hearing the presentation, please send us a message in the Q&A box and we'll do our best to assist you. DFID has undergone some big changes in recent months, including ministerial reorganisations and the appointment of Rory Stewart as the new Secretary of State. And it looks like further changes could be looming on the horizon with a new Prime Minister due to be appointed at the end of the month. To discuss all that and more, I'm joined today by our Deputy News Editor, Jessica Abrams, who will guide us through some of these key changes at DFID in recent years, and also what could be coming down the line in the future, including in a post-Brexit world. Then our Australia-based reporter and data journalist Lisa Cornish will provide a deeper insight into DFID's disbursement data and highlight some key funding trends. You can download our most recent report on DFID disbursement using the link in your resource list on screen. And feel free to submit your questions at any time in the Q&A box. We'll leave some time after the presentations to respond to those questions and get through as many as possible. So with that, I'd like to hand it off to Jess.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. As Sophie said, I'm Devex's Deputy Editor. I'm based in London. So I'm just going to run through sort of the bigger picture political and policy context about what's been going on at DFID over the past few years before Lisa kind of takes a deep dive into the data to see how that's playing out in funding. So the last few years obviously have been a period of huge upheaval and change for DFID, particularly since 2015, I think. So that's the period I'm really going to focus on these last 4 years. A big part of that, of course, has been all the changes in leadership. So hopefully, as you might be able to see in the image we're showing on the screen now, we've had 4 secretaries of state in those last 4 years, and we're likely to have a 5th one by the end of the month. And then also at the lower level, at the lower ministerial level, there have been a lot of changes as well. So I think with the exception of Harriet Baldwin, who's been in her position for about 18 months now, the rest of the ministerial team has changed within the last couple of months. So there really have been a lot of changes, and that can all be really disruptive to the work of the department. Ministers coming in have to learn new briefs. They have to learn how the department works. They might have different priorities or working styles that civil servants have to adjust to. And on top of that, I think some people would say it's a problem in terms of accountability. And more than anything else, it's frustrating for staff who really just want to get on with their job. I think that's probably the biggest thing I'm hearing from people within DFID. So let's just have a quick look at some of those changes at the top over the last few years. I think if we move to the next slide, we can see that. So we had Justine Greening, who had been in the role since 2012, but was then reappointed following the general election in May 2015. She then lasted another year until the change of government after the Brexit referendum. So in July 2016, she was replaced by Priti Patel, who again lasted a little over a year until she was toppled by the Israel scandal, to be replaced by Penny Mordaunt in November 2017, who then, again, with further Brexit reshuffles, lasted until May this year and was replaced by Rory Stewart, who might just about make it until the end of this month and take the crown as DFID's shortest ever Secretary of State, which is pretty impressive given Valerie Amos's 6-month stint in 2003. So I'm not expecting necessarily all of these changes to show up in the data, because obviously when a new minister arrives with new priorities, it can take a while for those to really work their way through the system. But as a starting point, I thought we'd have a quick look at some of the political trends we've seen over that time, and then we can have a think later about how we're seeing that in the data. So starting in 2015 with Justine Greening, 2015 was a good year for UK aid in that that's when the 0.7% aid spending target was set into law, and we've been meeting it ever since. Perhaps counterintuitively, I'd say there's maybe mixed feelings about that that having that target enshrined in law in the sector, because it's the only government budget that's been legally protected in a time of austerity. Some people feel that it might have made it a bit of a target for populist politicians and conservative media, and that the impact of that media criticism is something I'm going to come back to a little bit later on. But nonetheless, it was a big win for the aid sector. The aid budget has grown quite a lot over the past decade or two in order to meet it. And the good thing with all these changes of government is that leaders can't easily change how much is spent on aid because it is set in law. What they can do, of course, is change how that money is spent. And 2015 was also the year when the cross-government aid strategy came in. If we just move to the next slide, I think we can see some of these points being highlighted. So the cross-government aid strategy aims to spend 30% of the UK aid budget outside of DFID. So at the moment, DFID is spending only about 75% of the aid budget. And that's been one of the really big stories for DFID watchers over the past few years. I think with a general feeling that DFID has spent 20 years building a reputation for itself as one of the most experienced and evidence-driven donors out there. So there's a general concern about what happens to that as the budget starts getting handed out to perhaps less experienced departments. And the other issue with it, of course, is that other departments have different motivations. They don't have a pure poverty reduction mandate. And that cross-government strategy has come hand in hand with the rise of what might be described as the national interest agenda in UK aid. And that was something that was really strongly emphasised by both Priti Patel and Penny Mordaunt. It's the idea that aid can and should simultaneously serve the interests of recipient countries and the UK's own national interest. So what the national interest actually means in practice is kind of open to interpretation. It might mean focusing spending on particular parts of the world, perhaps where there's conflict or instability, or where there are drivers for a lot of migration, particularly to Europe and the UK. Or it might mean focusing on particular sectors, or it might mean spending more through private sector investments. So it'll be interesting to have a look at some of the trends we can identify in the data with Lisa a little on. I'd be interested to hear from you guys as well about how you're seeing that play out. But I think it's fair to say that at least some of the time it's more rhetoric than anything else. It's perhaps seen by politicians as a way of responding to a lot of that media criticism that I mentioned earlier, and something we saw under Patel in particular, but also Mordaunt perhaps to a slightly lesser degree, was a real concern with responding to media criticisms of aid, which played out in various ways, one of which was the crackdown on private sector contractors, which have really come under huge criticism from certain parts of the press. We keep seeing headlines about fat cats or accusations that companies are profiteering off the aid budget. So since late 2016, early 2017, there's really been a crackdown on private sector contractors. The regulations have become much tighter. And I think Lisa's data is going to show us that there was already a reduction in the use of private contractors prior to that anyway. But particularly now, it's perhaps no surprise that we're seeing quite a tough environment for UK contractors and quite a few who are now struggling to stay afloat. And then coming on to more recent times under Rory Stewart is when we've seen more of a shift away from that kind of rhetoric and more towards a focus on the power of aid just in and of itself. He focuses a lot on climate in particular, which again, I think it's going to be too soon to be able to see any of that in the data, but we've seen recent commitments to massively boost the proportion of UK aid that's being spent directly on climate change issues. And also to spend all UK aid in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. And for our Pro subscribers, we have an article up online about what that commitment is likely to mean in practice. So you can go and have a read of that if you're interested. The other big theme or trend that Stuart is really keen on is localization. And again, we've got a story on that out this morning if anybody wants to dig into that a little deeper. But to cut a long story short, the latest DFID annual report really highlighted this trend of centralization, that more and more aid money is being managed by Whitehall rather than by the in-country local offices. And that's something Stuart really wants to go against. He's a big believer in adapting aid to local context, to expanding DFID's base of on-the-ground experts and sort of devolving more power to the local offices. But of course, the big question is whether Stuart is likely to be in power long enough to really implement any of that. Which brings us nicely on to the next big theme, which is Brexit. And Brexit, obviously, has been another really disruptive force for the whole of government, including DFID, ever since the referendum more than 3 years ago. It's what sparked a lot of the leadership changes we've seen over the last few years. And it's also created a lot of uncertainty for DFID. So some of the particular issues it's been dealing with have been staffing, because DFID is not a department that's working directly on the urgent planning for a no-deal Brexit. It's been asked to offer up its staff to departments that are doing that more urgent work. So the annual report last week noted that 134 DFID staff have so far been deployed to other departments in order to do that. Which is not an insignificant proportion of its UK-based workforce. And then on top of that, there are also staff within the department who have been redirected to work on its own no-deal preparations. And we don't know how many staff have been affected by that. There has been a prioritisation exercise to make sure that its core work is protected, so that regardless of any diversions, it's still meeting the 0.7%, and that its work is still focused on poverty reduction and so on. But aside from those very basic reassurances, we don't know much. The department hasn't released the prioritisation exercise, although they've been asked by the opposition to do so, but they declined. We ourselves at Devex actually put in a freedom of information request to try and obtain it, but again, they wouldn't release it. So we don't really know what the contents of that document are, and we don't know what work or what programmes have been most affected by the diversions caused by Brexit. The other big questions for DFID related to Brexit have been how to protect UK NGOs that are currently receiving EU funding, because that's likely to be cut off on our departure date, especially if we leave without a deal. And there's been, for those of you who've been following this, there's been a lot of drama over that question over the last year or so. There's kind of back and forth between Westminster and Brussels over how that's going to be managed. And then finally, in March, DFID agreed to underwrite all those contracts. So if we leave without a deal and UK NGO contracts with the EU are cut off, DFID has agreed to put up £90 million, basically as an insurance package. So it agrees to take on those contracts if it has to, in order to avoid a funding cliff edge in the case of a no-deal Brexit. The other question is the future of UK-EU development cooperation and how far that's going to be able to continue after Brexit. And as I said earlier, I think the UK has historically really been Europe's leading aid donor. It's had the largest aid budget. It's got a really well-established dedicated aid agency. It's the only major European economy to currently be hitting the 0.7% spending target. And it's very well-respected, very experienced donor. And I think that expertise and insight is really valued at the European level. So there's a question now with Brexit about whether there's going to be a loss of that influence at the European level and what that means for both the UK and the EU. Already, as of 2017, I think Germany is actually spending more on aid in absolute terms than the UK. So the UK spends a higher percentage of its national income on aid, but because Germany has a bigger economy, it's now giving more actual money and has overtaken the UK as the world's second biggest bilateral donor after the US. And then equally in France, we're seeing kind of pro-aid moves under Macron. We've got this big push to reform the French aid package and to boost its spending. So not only with Brexit, but because also of all the other trends I've been talking about over the past 5 or 10 minutes, there's a kind of bigger picture question about whether the UK is going to be able to maintain its position as Europe's aid leader. And moving on to the final point, of course, the biggest threat to DFID in terms of that is this existential question about its future. Boris Johnson, who is likely to become Prime Minister in the next couple of weeks, has previously talked about rolling it in with the Foreign Office, from whence it originally came 20 years ago. And that's something that we've really been hearing different perspectives on. Some people are really worried about the future existence of the department and think this is a real possibility. Others believe that, that's maybe a little bit dramatic and that it's probably safe for the time being. But perhaps, as Stuart himself has said, the more realistic scenario is that DFID continues operating as an independent department, but that there's some kind of restructuring or reorganisation that gives the Foreign Office a bit more control over what it does. So I think on that slightly mellow note, that's where I'm going to stop for now. If you have any questions about anything I've mentioned, feel free to drop them into the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to dig into them a little bit deeper at the end. But for now, I'm going to pass you over to Lisa to have a look at the data.
Thank you, Jess. Transition on to my first slide. So in terms of the analysis that I'm looking at, I'm actually going to look at disbursement data from DFID. So what is disbursement data? How is it different from looking at ODA or aid-specific data? Well, disbursement data is part of the UK government's commitment to transparency in expenditure. DFID is required to provide a monthly updated list of all financial transactions for spending over a specified threshold. It's published on the UK government's open data website, which is data.gov.uk, and the most recent month published was May 2019. Since April 2011, the reporting threshold has been £500. Before this time, the threshold was £25,000. So there's a big difference. And with this threshold, the disbursement data can take us beyond aid. And we're looking at any financial transaction that's been recorded over £500. So it can really include a very expensive one if it goes on the corporate credit card as well. So we're getting into some really detailed data. Aid disbursement is part of the data, but it also allows us insight into non-ODA spending that can help us understand the broader DFID operations. So what does the disbursement data show? So by looking at the data, we can see spending by month, and we can see peaks in spending by DFID divisions, sectors, as well as quickly identifying common payment schedules. So when we look at the monthly trends, for some payment cycles, it becomes clear that there's a major spend on particular months and quarters for either a division or a particular activity. We can also see the key partners through the data. So through the listed data, to the listed disbursement recipients, we can see DFID's key partners for various aspects of their operation and program delivery, and how this has been changing since 2011. So new partners might be required for new strategies or approaches or activities, and we can see how this changes. We can also see program priorities. So the data breaks down by divisions and payment types, and we can help see regional or sector priorities where that's available and changes, including perhaps looking at sexual and reproductive health, for example. And of course, we get that non-ODA and aid spending, which can include ICT, travel, reviews, consultancies, and more. To analyse the disbursement data, Devex collated the data from 2011 to 2018. So this is the period of time when all the disbursements are covering the same figure, which is above £500. And then we want to have a full year of data. So at the moment, the most recent data is May 2019. So we want to give a full year analysis to have a look at those trends. So we've collated the data from 2011 to 2018. And using Tableau, which is a business intelligence product that allows us to publish interactive visualizations, we have delivered a way to interact with the data, pulling together the monthly reports in a single tool. So rather than going through hundreds of Excel spreadsheets or CSV files. We've actually put the data together so you can analyse it in one tool. The disbursement data is still limited in the detail available. DFID don't want to give away too much of their spending secrets, but we're able to delve into the data interactively by time, sector, division, and supplier to discover what has changed in DFID operations. There's limited detail in the actual spending activities, so we don't have really detailed description, but it's enough to really give us an overview of insights and give us some really interesting trends. So when we pulled together the data, there were key insights that we did identify. So one was decline in some numbers. First, there was a decline in disbursements between 2017 and 2018, as well as fewer implementers supporting DFID's programs and delivery. A total of £8.6 billion was disbursed in 2018, which was a 7% decline from 2017. 2017 was a peak year for the disbursements in the period we've looked at, which was £9.2 billion. The number of implementing partners had steadily declined between 2014 and 2018, from 2,496 implementing partners to 1,259. So there was definitely a reduction in the amount of partners that were supporting DFID through this disbursement data. When we look at the partner breakdowns, overall, the trends remain the same. It's very consistent in the percentage breakdown. Multilateral and supranational organisations have been the largest source of disbursement data since 2011, and in 2018 they counted for almost 60% of disbursements received. Academic institutions accounted for less than 1%, and they've continued to be the smallest partner throughout the years. With multilateral organisations playing a large role in the overall disbursements, they also top the list of implementing partners, which we'll discuss further shortly. You notice on this slide as well that there is unknowns in terms of the sectors that are being covered. So there is still gaps in the disbursement data. We don't necessarily see all the organisations receiving funds through the disbursement data, despite it being a transparency tool. So that's just something important to note there. In breaking down the data by divisional spending, we see that there has been activity across time to centralise spending more. And by this, I don't mean pulling it into the UK. I just mean by simplifying the number of divisions that they have and the spending associated with it. So DFID's International Relations Division was responsible for the largest spend in 2018. Disbursing $1.45 billion, followed by the Policy Division, which disbursed $1.33 billion, and the East and Central Africa Division, which disbursed $1.29 billion. The shift in the divisions from 2011, we've definitely narrowed it down. So in 2011, the funds were distributed across 23 program areas, and in 2018, it was significantly smaller. This makes it a little bit difficult to analyse how it's changed within the divisions across time when there's no consistency in the actual structure, and this is a problem that will emerge in the future as well if there is changes or in the DFID structure. Now, I want to go into some really interesting insights that come from this that can shape a little bit of what Jess has discussed previously and what we might discuss after this. Looking at the shifting partner priorities, we can see some really big trends. So on this chart here, I've just simply looked at the 2018 value that the different sectors were dispersed and subtracted the 2011 value from that. So the first thing that we can see is that big drop in the value going to private sector partners. That is very obvious in the data here. So we can see spending on consultancy, which has seen a 99% decrease since 2011. So this is one thing that private sector partners are often associated with, and it certainly comes up as part of criticism. So in 2012, there were concerns that were published by the media about UK consultants reaping too much from the aid program. But overall, really, I'll just flick back to that previous slide for a second. We see that 2011, it was $1.1 million in consultancy versus a small amount in 2018. So this also goes down to a little bit of the definitions used in the data. So a consultant versus consultancy activities is a little bit different, if that makes sense. And understanding the definitions in the data versus what the media might perceive as consultant activities are a little bit different. So I wouldn't necessarily say that that drop there is a result of this activity because we're starting off from quite a low base. Going back to our partner priorities again, I just want to highlight another big thing that pops up. And this is the disbursements going to multilateral and supranational organisations, which is a real standout. It's a jump of $1.6 billion, which is quite massive over that period of time. So I just want to delve into that a little bit to see what we can get from that. So in 2018, multilateral organisations are at the top of the disbursement food chain here. The United Nations, followed by the World Bank and European Commission, were the top suppliers. This is overall, not just divided into multilateral organisations. We don't see large consultancy companies as the big suppliers, despite the fact that there's one there that it says supplier name withheld. Now that could be multiple organisations and it could cover various sectors, so I don't really want to speculate on that, even though it's important to note. But it is the multilateral organisations that are at the top here. In our Tableau Interactive, we looked at the top 20 suppliers across years by sector, and this is the list of the top 20 multilateral partners for 2011, where we can see that the World Bank was at the top. They received £1.4 billion in disbursements for the year. When we flick through, we can still see that World Bank in 2012 is at the top again. This year they received $1.6 billion, I think. In 2013, again, they were at the top of the list, again increasing in value. 2014, there was a slight drop in what they received, but again, the World Bank was at the top. 2015, once again, a decline, but they were still at the top, well above the number 2 placed United Nations. And 2016, again, they received $1.7 billion. Something happened in 2017, which was very different based on what we've previously seen. So the United Nations jumps to the number 1 spot here, and it's a massive increase. So they've gone from receiving £817 million in disbursements the previous year to $2.1 billion. In 2018, this was pretty much replicated, receiving a similar amount with $2.1 billion in disbursements. And this is a big jump in comparison to the other leading partners. So although there were shifts in what the likes of the World Bank and European Commission has received over this period of time, it generally remained steady. There wasn't this massive jump that we saw at the United Nations. So what changed? Were there new programs or new initiatives? What made this happen? The answer was that there was a massive increase in money that is being dispersed to aid programs that are classified as voluntary contributions. This is money going to ODA, so it's classified as ODA, but it's not programs being developed in DFID. They're going directly to the United Nations and other partners to do the work. This is a common way of outsourcing aid programs without needing to bring in private sector contractors. In Australia, for example, we have seen this with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade here. But it's important to note that there was an overall drop in the value of disbursements in 2018, which I mentioned at the start. So this is not new money that DFID don't know what to do with. It's a change in the way that they are delivering their existing ODA, which is relying on less internal expertise. Now, I don't want to speculate as to whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. It's just something different that we do see in the data, and it's something that I think is important to highlight as a shift that's changed as we've seen this shifting chairs and the shifting operations within DFID. At the same time, through the disbursement data, things that are classified as being for aid, that's not for the voluntary contributions, definitely didn't follow that same pattern. So the voluntary contributions is definitely special and doing its own thing. Overall, since 2011, there was a 29% increase over the same period, and we've seen a decline here since 2015 in how the money is being dispersed. Jumping back again to our shifting partners, I want to just highlight another thing there which stands out, which is the increase that went to UK government entities. So that's a £400 million increase that we're seeing. And I just want to look into what that is potentially about. What we're seeing is disbursements to the CDC. Now, the CDC is the UK government's development financial institution. Disbursements to the CDC first appear in the data in 2013, not 2011, and it's just £500,000. By 2017, they were dispersing £378 million and £360 million in 2018. Again, these are listed within the data as voluntary aid program contributions, but it's a massive shift again, showing how DFID intend to deliver the aid program, with potentially DFIs playing a larger role. Once more, I just want to quickly jump back to this slide and just highlight again that how our partners has changed with NGOs and CSOs or civil society. They've remained a key partner over this period of time. The overall value that they've received has increased, but generally it remains steady. But something that we can see through the data is some of the shifting priorities in the aid program through the top partners. So in 2018, we did see a big jump in disbursements to Marie Stopes International. They were second behind the International Committee of the Red Cross, who received £159 million in disbursements to support humanitarian responses in Africa, Asia and the Middle East. And their funds increased from 5% from 2017. But Marie Stopes International increased from the fourth largest NGO or CSO implementer to the second largest, thanks to a 31% increase in disbursements received between 2017 and 2018. Their disbursements aim to support maternal and child health and family planning programs and has been steadily increasing since 2012. So this could be seen as a response to Trump politics to bridge the gap in sexual and reproductive health funding. But it could also see that these changing in politics may come at the expense of other partnerships, because we have seen a lot of downward arrows against the top 20 NGOs and CSO partners in 2018 in that slide. Now, just in terms of the data and how we could use this to look at what changes and what is happening within DFID, I want to give us plenty of time for questions and answers, but I just want to highlight some of the questions of my own thinking that I'd be looking at the data and what we can be looking at. So I do think because the disbursement data is published monthly, it's one of the earlier indications that we'll probably see that there is big shifts in spending or programs that are stopping. So what should we be looking for? One of them will be, will the partners continue to decline? So we'll be able to see this by tallying up the number of unique partners that are in there. Will there also be an increased reliance on multilateral institutions as partners? So will we see this trend again to be delivering more funds via the United Nations and external partners? Will DFID continue to respond to gaps created in US and other foreign policy? Will there be a change of structure and divisions, which Jess was mentioned earlier? That will be a nightmare, again, to analyse the data. So hopefully not from my end, but we certainly will see that in terms of how the reporting comes out there. Whether there'll be a geographic or sectoral shift, this would also be seen through the divisions, whether there is a reduced focus in certain areas, whether there's less funds available, less activities, we may see this. So whether DFID will change their footprint. And as I've mentioned, I really think that disbursement data may be amongst the first signs that there will be any shifts within the operations of DFID. So I just want to leave that there and open it up to Q&A and give you back to Sophie, who will host the Q&A part of this session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa and Jess. Before we get into the questions, a number of people have been asking whether we're going to share the slides and a recording afterwards, and the answer is yes. So in terms of questions, maybe picking up where sort of Lisa left off, really, we've had a couple of questions sort of asking whether there's any one region that is receiving the largest share of DFID money now, or do we see it in the future? And sort of linked to that was a question about whether we sort of know much about Boris Johnson's priorities in terms of, I guess, regions, but also type of work he might be interested in, where that might move things in the future. So I guess that's a question for both of you, really.
Just in terms of looking at that within the disbursement data, it doesn't go down into specifics of where the money is being spent. So the disbursement data, I wouldn't be looking at that for regional information. There is some information that will come up that it might specify this is a program for Afghanistan or a certain region, but you won't get the real detail through disbursement data. You'll need to look at other ODA spending and other aid-specific expenditure data, not the disbursement data for that one.
Yeah, I think regionally, Africa, the general continent of Africa tends to be DFID's biggest focus area. And I think with the kind of national interest rhetoric that I was talking about, that's likely to remain the case, partially because there's been a lot of migration to the UK. How much that's actually playing out in DFID spending is hard to say. It's definitely played out clearly at the EU level, that EU funding has very clearly been channeled towards origin countries of migration to Europe. I don't think it's played out as clearly with DFID, even though there has still been some of this migration rhetoric. But I don't think it really shows up in the funding data so much. But nonetheless, Africa tends to be the main focus, and also with a general increase in humanitarian spending as well. That's likely to remain the same. As for Boris Johnson, so Johnson is not historically anti-aid, so it's something he's picked up more recently over the last 2 years, maybe, probably because he sees it as a vote winner. So it's not something that he's been particularly nuanced about. You know, he's not gone into detail about where he might want to see aid going instead. I think if he does come into power, we're likely just to see, again, this renewed emphasis on the national interest and things like migration and maybe security interests. And I mean, there's so many different things you could tie that into, Ebola even, and the potential health threat that might pose, you could tie it into. So I'd say with Johnson, it's more likely to be rhetoric than it is to actually really affect funding.
Okay, some questions on procurement. Do you think some of the strategic changes with implications in terms of changing DFID's procurement processes for suppliers, for example, shifting towards procuring through large framework agreements?
That will definitely see, in terms of the use of the disbursement data, one of the things that will change there is if you're going through larger facilities, so an organisation that will then subcontract elements, you'll get less visibility as to what's actually happening. So this is something that I'll bring in the Australian example. It has happened in Australia. This is what we've seen. And then there was the challenge that there was less visibility on how Australian aid money was being spent. So now DFID has gone to create this subcontractor portal to have better visibility on how their major contractors are actually spending money. So this will create a challenge, and it's important to think about this as well as to what it means in understanding how the spending is being directed. So it's an important thing to look at the examples of what's happened elsewhere, learn from them, and really ensure that DFID is implementing the right practices early, learning from the mistakes of the likes of DFID when they've gone down this path because they didn't have the internal capacity to deliver the aid program, and how that actually means in terms of educating and informing of government spending. So looking at larger contracts is going to be extremely challenging for you as development professionals out there. It may result in less visibility unless you're on top of this earlier and are really urging DFID to ensure that the practices are better, and that you'll be able to actually see those subcontracting opportunities through that.
Another question on, again, on sort of private sector spending. Simon Vickers asked, what explains the reduction in private sector spend, and do you expect that to continue?
In terms of the disbursement data, I'm not sure how much lower that will go. So the element that will go to the aid program is probably where it's actually going to be more of a challenge. But there's also partners in there that are helping to deliver with the, ICT within London. There's also, the furniture and catering. So there will always be an element within that data of the private sector partners. But within the actual aid program and how that's delivered, I might flick that over to Jess to see if she can answer that.
Yeah, so as I talked a little bit about in my presentation, there's been a lot of media criticism of private sector aid contractors, and that seems to sort of tie in with the drop in spending through them that Lisa showed in the data. And of course, in 2017, these new regulations were introduced that kind of tightened up on them and introduced new sort of reporting requirements and that sort of thing. I don't know if that's the only explanation for why there's been such a drop, but I think the political context explains at least part of it. And certainly we've done quite a lot of reporting over the last few months about the situation that a lot of UK-based contractors are finding themselves in, that money's drying up a little bit, that times have become quite tough.
Great. Also had a couple of people asking for some clarity on what's meant by voluntary contributions.
Good question. Now, this is just additional funds that are given. So it's not specifically allocated for any particular program or activity. So these are just funds to the organisation. This is also something that probably needs to be a little bit clarified as to how people within the organisation are categorising funding. So we can see, depending on who actually needs to put it in the systems, understanding what the definitions are and how things are going into the system, that might also be a little bit of a challenge as to how things are being identified. But it's not necessary. It appears that it's not specifically tied to particular activities, particular needs. This is just to the organisation to support their overall objectives. That's my understanding. But again, it's also about the understanding of the people that are allocating it to that classification within DFID. Could also be a little bit of changes across the data as to how things are being defined in sectors, which could see a little bit of a jump in this, but highly likely not as big as what we've seen. It's been a dramatic increase, and that's just not about definitions. It's something else. So I hope that answers the question.
Also, a question, do we have any data on the overhead costs of managing disbursements? Like what DFID spending on this?
In terms of the management of that, there is some information. It's delving into how things are defined. There is some management associated, but you'd probably need to think about what's actually involved in that process. So we don't have staffing costs. So staffing costs are not part of that unless there was a contractor that came in. But in terms of managing, there's a whole bunch of elements that can go into it. There's not a particular category that says management of disbursement. So it's a matter of understanding exactly what's going on there and grouping those to get a good understanding. But that's something that we can look into at Devex in terms of getting additional insight from this data for you.
Great. And actually, I can probably provide some information there. The annual report that DFID released last week does give a sort of percentage figure on the amount of money that goes on sort of organizational costs, so staffing, etc. And it's just over 3%. And Rory Stewart, giving evidence before the International Development Committee quite recently, said that he wanted to actually increase that to sort of more like 5 or 6%, which is sort of what we see in the French and German development agencies, for example, and again also in the US they have higher costs. But so some of that data will be in the annual report if people want to look. Another question: is there any data on the amount of money going to faith-based groups?
Well, yes, within the data you can actually look for specific organisations. So we didn't divide that into faith-based versus other NGOs. We certainly can go in and pull those out and define that. But you can also look within the data yourself of identifying faith-based organisations and seeing where they are and how that's changed across time. So they certainly weren't up the top of the list there. But yes, that should be available. It is within, as long as DFID are dispersing data through this means to them, it will be within the data and you can pull that out.
Great. A question on, Lisa, your slide on NGO and CSO partner rankings. Does it include funding they receive through contracts as well as grants? And is it possible to see a list with private sector companies also included?
In terms of the rankings, we allow you to go into private sector partners, civil society and multilateral. So you've got the option to break down by various groups there as well, so you can see the partners as well as academic. In terms of further breakdown, it's in from the data that you can download through data.gov as well, or through going through the interactive and engaging with it. So that should be there to give you as much detail as possible. Again, please let us know if there are things that you actually want to do with the data that you can't do through the interactive. So these are easy tweaks for us to make. So the more that you use it and the more that we find out what you need, the better we can improve these types of interactive tools.
Do we have a breakdown of spending between UK-based contractors and non-UK-based contractors? And the same in terms of UK-based NGOs or non-UK-based NGOs?
That's actually a good question. So it doesn't specify within the data in terms of where the suppliers or the suppliers are from. But that's something that we could potentially look at doing a value add from, to have a look at where these organisations are generally based and add that value there as well. So there is limits in terms of the amount of information that's in the disbursement data. So it isn't extremely detailed, as I said previously, in providing all the information of what the project is, where it's operating, who it's from, and where the organisation is. But there are value adds that us as Devex can also do to this data to really improve its use and usefulness. But there also might be things that the disbursement data is not necessarily the right fit for you. There might be other data as well out there that provides more detail breaking down that way as well. So there is a lot of other data sets out there, including contractor information and actually tender information that might actually be more useful in these situations.
Great. Question on the declining number of DFID partners. Do we have any sort of information about the nature of which partners are dropping off? Are they private sector or NGOs and small, medium, larger?
Yeah, it definitely appears to be smaller organisations, but there is drops across the board by sectors. So private sector definitely is decreasing, but we're also seeing smaller NGOs drop off. So there does appear just to be, it's almost like they're cementing the known partners or who they're working with. So there are preferred partners that they've got for the aid program, but this is across the various sectors. So it's not necessarily that there's a massive drop amongst private sector in terms of the number of partners compared to others. There is just definitely across the board a reduction as a whole, that rather than going out to a wider amount of organisations, that they're sticking with preferred suppliers. That said, there still is new suppliers that pop up each year, so it's not like DFID is closing down. So it's also a little bit of the divisions themselves that are conducting these activities, what the needs are. You would expect as well that in terms of the operation of DFID, that they're utilising a bit more whole of government contracts and suppliers that might reduce a lot of the waste that might happen centrally. So that is an area where I would be expecting a lot of that reduction in suppliers to be, not necessarily the aid program all the time. But yeah, it's not one particular sector that is being targeted.
Great. Question whether we have any UN data on the UN breakdown by voluntary contributions and earmarked contributions for specific projects and also by UN agencies.
Yeah, there definitely is. We can break down further by UN agency. So we can look at providing further detail on that. We might look at that for an additional story that can help you with those insights. But in terms of actually the detail of those voluntary contributions, it's not clear in the data. So we can ask questions though, and certainly find out a lot more. I think it does raise a lot of questions when I'm looking at the data. It certainly, it does raise questions of what's going on, what's the purpose, is this a new trend that we're seeing that's going to continue? And this is something that we do see elsewhere in other agencies. So is this the new way of delivering aid, and what does it mean in terms of development partners out there? But we'll look into making that available as new insights from the data as well.
Great. Question maybe for Jess here. What are the key differences between UK aid and US aid strategic priorities going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I'm no expert in USAID strategic priorities, so that's definitely something we can, I'm probably not well placed to make a really thorough comparison right now, but it's definitely something we can go back to some of our other colleagues to talk about and maybe dig into in a little bit more detail. But just one thing to pick up on is obviously the SRHR family planning sector, just because it's something that Lisa has raised and has just been very high profile. So obviously an area where the US is pulling back a lot, not only with the global gag rule, but also pulling its funding from UNFPA and all of those sorts of things. And is an area where we see the UK sort of quietly expanding. It didn't actively take part in the She Decides Fund, which was set up by the Dutch and Belgian governments as a direct response to the global gag rule. And I think there's some sense that was probably for political reasons. That didn't want to sort of be too vocal about its criticism of the US. That said, the UK government hasn't held back from emphasising the importance of SRHR and family planning, the full range of family planning services, since all of that came in, and it launched its what would probably be seen as its big response at the end of last year, even though it wasn't explicitly framed as a response to the global gag rule, in the form of the WISH Fund, I think it's Women's Integrated Sexual Health Programme, which is targeting mainly contraception and family planning services. So that's just one key area of divergence I would highlight. But in terms of the broader strategic divergences, I think I'd want to pull in some other colleagues to dig into that a little bit more.
Sticking on the family planning and SRHR angle, are we able to sort of say where the funding for family planning, but also maternal and newborn child health that Lisa's talked about having steadily increased is coming from? Is it coming from the traditional population and reproductive health pot, or from new pots of money such as climate change or health systems?
Yeah, I'm going to leave Lisa to answer that one mainly because I haven't looked at the data and I'm not sure if it tells us that. But I do think that's a very interesting question, especially because Sophie, as you know, we've done some reporting recently on the kind of crossover between increasing links between climate change programming and family planning programming. And then, of course, with the big push for universal health coverage and so on, it's possible that it's being pulled into some of that. I would guess that it's kind of a question of categorization and semantics, and that, you know, sometimes funding tends to fall into two pots and it's just sort of randomly allocated to one or the other. That would be my guess, but I'm going to hand over to Lisa, who probably knows a little bit more.
Well, I'm actually going to say that this is probably not a question for the disbursement data. So the disbursement data, I really think is good to start asking these questions again, but that would actually be a question that you might need to look at the IATI data, which is really specific to aid, and we'll look a bit more into that side or other elements. You will be able to see through the disbursement data the divisions that this is coming from. So that certainly might help with explaining that, whether it is from one division or multiple divisions, but there's also divisions that are focused on regions. So we're not necessarily saying, you won't necessarily be able to see if it's from climate activities through the disbursement data. There would be other avenues or other data sources that would probably be better to answer that. But again, it's really showing the value of disbursement data, really starting to ask a lot of questions in what's going on, and then looking at that next stage to delve a little bit deeper into understanding what's happening at DFID, or even going back to DFID and asking them the questions.
Sounds like a good opportunity to ask a sort of maybe a closing question for Lisa. What are the limitations of the data? And when people are looking at it for themselves, what should they be aware of? And then also, could you give a quick sort of guide to people for when to look out for new editions of the data, like how often we're publishing it and how they can access it?
We'll start with the last part first. It is updated monthly. It's available on data.gov.uk, so you can look at disbursement. It's actually better to try to find it via Google, actually. So if you could Google DFID disbursement data, put in the £500, you should be able to find it. As I said, it's updated monthly, but there is a lag. So at the moment, the most recent one based on my last check was May 2019. The June one could be out. I'm not sure exactly what their cycle is. In terms of the challenges and limitations in looking at it, it's really important, first of all, to understand that the data is as good as what goes in. So the user's putting information depending on their understanding of categories, about definitions. There might be limitations in the data. There is some organisations that are not listed, which can create some big gaps in the data in terms of our real understanding of where money is going to, big and small. The reason that there is gaps, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm sure it's got something to do with privacy or business confidentiality or something like that. But I'm not going to speculate on any sectors that are in the missing data. But it's also with the fact that different users are putting information in, there's also different levels of detail based on the different records. So some you'll get some really insightful information about what the funds are going for. Others you'll just get really the basic information. So it's very all over the place, but this is part of the reporting requirement. So it really just goes down to the different individuals as to how much detail they're going to put into it. But it is, even though it is part of transparency, there is a limited number of fields and information that are available. So it's really valuable in terms of seeing these overall trends and insights by sectors, by division, and looking at the different partners. In terms of matching up the partners, now we went in and did a lot of name cleaning involved in that as well. So you could easily get multiple versions of the same organisation name just because people put them in differently. So just warning you that it's not the best quality of data, that you can put it all together and everything works perfectly. But it certainly is worth the effort. That said, Devex have put it together in an interactive. So if you're able to use it and engage with it and provide us feedback on actually what you want to do with this data, we can look at adding more value and functions in terms of this interactive tool to help you with insights, so that you can use this as a way of engaging with the data rather than having to download all the CSV files yourselves and put them into your system. Feel free to do that if you want to. If you want to engage with that data, it is a little bit of a nightmare getting it all together, just to warn you. But again, well worth the effort. So I hope that helps. I know we're at the top of the hour now and we've gone a little bit over. But the more that Devex and the likes of the business intelligence component of Devex can do to help you with your business requirement, we would love to do that. So please feel free to reach out to us and let us know how we can best assist your needs.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lisa. And also thank you, Jess, for all your insights. As Lisa said, we've come to the end of the webinar. We will be sending out a link to the recording of the webinar in an email soon. So thank you very much for joining us. Please look out for our future coverage on DFID and the trends, and also future upcoming digital events. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.